I'm really delighted to be introducing Clara Bingham, who's written a very interesting book, A Witness to the Revolution, which chronicles a tumultuous period from the end of the 1960s to the start of the 1970s. Clara, as you no doubt can tell just by looking at her, wasn't actually old enough to experience or appreciate much of the 60s when they were happening. She didn't graduate college until the mid-1980s, but she has very well-developed skills as a journalist and a writer that have enabled her to go back and in a rather distinctive way capture that earlier time of social and political upheaval in our country. In her early years as a journalist, Clara worked for Newsweek here in Washington, covering the administration of George H.W. Bush. She's written since for a number of magazines. She's also authored a couple of previous books, Women on the Hill, and Class Action, about a landmark sexual harassment case in the 1980s and 1990s. That second book inspired the movie North Country, starring Charlize Theron and Frances McDormand, which some of you may remember. And Clara has done a little movie producing herself. She was one of those behind the 2011 documentary, The Last Mountain, which tells the story of the battle between coal strip miners and environmentalists over a mountain in West Virginia. So Clara is indeed multi-talented. Her new book is an oral history. It draws on interviews that Clara did with 100 people, some famous, others not, people whom she calls leaders and foot soldiers of the 60s peace movement. She focuses on the year between August 1969 and September 1970, a period that began with Woodstock, ended with the death of Jimi Hendrix, and included in between escalating anti-war protests, the publication of the My Lai massacre story, the first draft lottery, the killing of Black Panthers by Chicago police, the indictment of Charles Manson, the invasion of Cambodia, the Kent State and Jackson State shootings, and much, much more. Sort of makes our current election campaign seem tame by comparison. A New York Times review called Witness to Revolution, quote, a surprisingly powerful and moving book. And a book list review said Clara succeeds in capturing the essence of those earlier chaotic times and enables readers to see that era in a new light. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Clara Bingham.
Thank you so much, Bradley. And I'm so happy to be here. I believe in politics and prose and independent bookstores, and this is one of the best in the entire country. So thank you for keeping this industry alive and for bringing out so many amazing people. I actually did a reading here in 2002 for my last book, which has been a while since I've written a book. So it's very happy for me to come back home. I'm going to show you first a short 4-minute teaser to the book. So is it possible to turn lights down or not? Okay, great. Here we go.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. I would like to answer some of the questions that I know are on the minds of many of you listening to me. How and why did America get involved in Vietnam in the first place?
We were like 21, 22, 23 years old. We were kids. We were people who'd come up in activism. We were born in the civil rights movement. We were then born in the anti-war movement. We were born in the women's movement and in the beginning of the queer movement. So all this ferment was happening. And one principle was look to the most oppressed.
The combination of the word black and power shocked the nation. I mean, white people went nuts. You know, they just went nuts.
With the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary, and you're gonna have to keep on saying that.
When Fred Hampton was murdered, even though I was incarcerated at the time. I knew immediately that Fred did not die at the hands of the police officers with the guns who invaded his home. That was set up. And later it was proven that it was set up.
We've got to be out there and not just applauding from the sidelines. But we identified that as being racist, to not take any of the costs.
I was convinced that these guns were not loaded with live ammo. I thought, well, how ridiculous would that be? Until I saw the ground in front of me churn up, and I realized at that moment that they were live bullets. I was also shot at that point.
The guard all turn in unison and they all shoot in unison. 61 to 67 bullets at unarmed students. My sister was 343 feet away from her shooters.
You had people linking arms and being pepper sprayed or cannoned or beaten for calling for an end to the war. You saw moments and were part of moments where the human spirit was really at its best.
I think it's fair to say that we lost all our political struggles in the 60s. We didn't end capitalism, we didn't end imperialism, we didn't end racism, we didn't actually end the war in Vietnam. However, we did win all the cultural battles. There's no place in the United States you can go today where there's not a women's movement, an environmental movement, alternative health movements. These things are exerting long-term pressures that are deeply and subtly transformative. And it was our assertion then that they were more powerful than politics.
So maybe that brings back some memories. All of those voices that you heard were from tape-recorded interviews that I had with about 100 people who were involved in all different parts of the movement for social change. And I feel humbled to be here in front of all of you because clearly everyone in this room saw much more than I did. And I was born in 1963, I have to confess. And I wrote this book because I knew that I missed it. And I was very, I was, you know, I don't want to say upset. I do wish I was born 15 years earlier or 20 years earlier, but this is as close as I could get to going back in time and discovering why my life was the way it was, why it is, why I graduated from college in 1985 and could do any job I wanted to do and live any sort of lifestyle I wanted to live. And I considered this book an intergenerational exploration. I was coming from Mars to a new country, and I had no axe to grind. I just wanted to know why everything mattered so much. And why did people just exactly 15 years before I graduated from college in May of 1970, why did 2.5 million students in 700 colleges not take their exams and go on strike in May after Kent State? And why had so many people sacrificed their lives, their security, their education, their families for the cause, whatever cause that was? And so I wanted to catch everybody while they were at a period of time in their lives to reflect and to look back now that we are 45 years out and reminisce about what they had done and how those years in the late 60s had changed their lives and how their lives and what they had done changed history. So I also, just my own background, I grew up in New York City on Central Park West, and my playground was the staging ground for the movement. And I was on swings and jungle gyms while massive demonstrations were going on all around me. And it was very clear to me that this was the wallpaper of my childhood in a way. And I was, aware but not aware that so much was changing. And my hometown heroes were Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm. I had pictures of them all over my wall, so that was how close it was, but yet so far. So I set about spending about 4 years traveling all over the country, finding people who could tell me their stories. And I chose the school year of 69-70 from August to August. And I decided that year, so many things, it was a very dark year, as you can tell. But it was the crescendo of the 60s. It was really the last gasp of this incredibly powerful, important decade. And I thought that if I could get people to tell me what happened to them during that year, it would be a lens through which to really see the whole decade. And so I set about finding everybody I possibly could. And there are many people in this book you've never heard of. And then many of the obvious characters, the Jane Fondas and Tom Haydens of the world, who also trusted me with their stories. And I wrote this as an oral history narrative because I, of course, didn't have anything to say besides an introduction and footnotes, and I really thought that readers would learn a lot, even on an emotional level, from hearing people's stories from their own mouths in their own words. And so I think what this book does do is we revisit that year in a very visceral way, because everyone is just telling me what they did, and I tried not to get in the way. I started in August of 69, which the two big events that I talked about in the book were Woodstock and a epiphany that Daniel Ellsberg had. At Woodstock, Joan Baez was pregnant, and she sang "We Shall Overcome" in a rainstorm to 500,000 young hippies who had convened on Max Yasgar's farm in upstate New York. And she was pregnant with David Harris's child, her husband, who had started the resistance, and he was in jail because he refused to report for the draft. And he was the student at the time, student body president at Stanford, and hundreds of other young men were following in his footsteps. A week after Woodstock, Daniel Ellsberg, who at the time was still at RAND in Santa Monica and was very much, and had been for years, part of the defense apparatus, was very pro-war, had worked in the Defense Department under LBJ, but was beginning to change. And he had spent 1967 in Vietnam working for the State Department, and at that time he realized that he did not think the war was winnable. And he also thought what was really going on there was immoral. And so he went to a peace conference in Philadelphia, where a man named Randy Keeler gave a speech. And Randy worked in the resistance office in San Francisco with David Harris, and he had gone to Exeter and Harvard and was at graduate school at Stanford. And he told his story, and he told everyone at the conference that he was planning to go to jail in the next few months. He'd just gotten married and was saying goodbye to his family. He knew it was going to be about 3 years, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And Ellsberg himself had a breakdown, a full-on breakdown. He retired to the bathroom and cried. I'm going to read you a little bit of what he told me. Randy said he was the only man left in the San Francisco War Resistance League office because all of the other men had been imprisoned, David Harris and several others. He said, "Pretty soon it'll be all women when I go to prison. I think that was the first moment that everybody in the audience had heard that he was going to prison. His trial was just after this, but he knew he would end up going to prison. But he said, I know that it'll be all right because all of you people will still be working against the war. So it was hitting everybody at once. He was crying slightly at this point. His voice was choking. And one by one, people were standing up, and eventually everybody was standing up, and nearly everybody was crying in the audience. Everybody was crying. I was crying. I got out of my chair and found the men's room, and as soon as I got there, I began sobbing hysterically. I was sitting on the floor of the bathroom sobbing and thinking, this is what my country has come to. That was the best thing a young man can do, is go to prison. And that's when I thought, my son is born for prison. He was 14 then, and indeed the war was still on when he turned 18. Finally, I got up and I washed my face in the basin and went back, still crying. Here were these people who were perceiving that it made sense for them to go to prison. So the point was not that I wanted to go to prison. I didn't. I never did. But that I should be willing to do everything up to and including prison or being killed like these other Americans. And that meant more significantly risking my clearance, my job, my career, all the other things that you risk short of prison. 1 month later, he went to a office of a friend of his in a strip mall in Santa Monica and began the slow, laborious process of Xeroxing the 7,000 pages of the Pentagon Papers, which the public didn't know about until 1971, much later. But it was when Ellsberg and so many of the people who I talked to had his moment of epiphany that he had to throw his life on the line to try to stop the war. By October 15th, the moratorium to end the war took place all over the country. And 2 million people stopped their jobs, held vigils and sit-ins, and even Midwesterners, even older people. This was no longer just a coastal, youthful event. And this was very terrifying to the Nixon administration because they could no longer just accuse the anti-war movement of being a bunch of young freak hippies. This was a real threat. And there were 4 people who ran the moratorium. They never thought 2 million people were going to actually convene. It was a complete shock to them. They had all worked for Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire in '68. They were clean for Gene. They were the straight anti-war group. And one of them was a man named David Mixner, who was closeted and gay. And he now lives in New York. And I talked to him. And he told me one of the more chilling stories of any of the stories that I heard. I'm going to read you a little bit of what he told me. I was terrified to tell my dad that if I was drafted, I wouldn't serve, which is sort of a joke now because all I had to do was tell them I was gay and I'd have been out instantly. But being in jail for 5 years appealed more to me than letting anyone know I was gay. It's pretty powerful, isn't it? That's all I had to say. I would rather have gone to jail than have anyone know the truth about me. I wouldn't have been allowed to do anything I was doing. I wouldn't have been a co-chair of the Vietnam moratorium if I were gay. Hell, I had to fight to get Marge Sklenkar, the only woman, aboard. Women were not given good roles. I was one of Marge's supporters. The movement was still misogynist at the time. Gay? Not a chance in the world would I be allowed to do any of it. I would have immediately been discarded. One night I got drunk, went to this really remote, dingy bar, and this vision of God came in, who was exactly my type. Intelligent, handsome, masculine, and we ended up going home together. He said, I know who you are. I work for the federal government. I don't want you to panic. I want to create a safe place for you. I really have feelings for you. He had everything I loved at his house. Tennyson, Neruda, Yeats, all of the great poets I loved, and Elvis Presley and Janis Joplin records. Anyhow, to make a long story short, we started an affair. And he did become a very safe place for me. About 30 days into it, he said he had to go away for the weekend. When he got back, he said, "Let's meet for lunch on Monday. I'll come straight from the airport," I said. "Great." So I went to the Hot Shop on K and 16th Street. I'm sure you guys all remember that. And sat in a booth waiting for him. 2 guys in suits pulled into the booth and sat across from me and showed me their badges. When someone shows you a badge, how many times have you taken a look at it, especially in those days? I don't know if they were real. They poured out on the table some naked pictures of the 2 of us having sex. It just was as if someone had stuck a knife into my gut. My first thought was, I have to warn Frank. So immediately afterwards, I ran to his apartment to warn him. I used my key, got in, and the place was totally empty. There wasn't a dust ball or anything else in the apartment. I never saw him again. The suits gave me 3 days to get out of moratorium, or they were going to send these pictures to my family and the press. So I got very, very drunk and told my friends I had a heart condition and was very sick. I decided to kill myself. I bought a gun and put it underneath my mattress and was going to kill myself, but I wanted to get drunk enough to do it. But then I had this moment of clarity and I realized that there was no way they could send the photos to the press because how are they going to explain it? Did the government really want to know that they were filming homosexuals and blackmailing them? Maybe they had as much to lose as I did. So I sobered up, and when they met up with me 3 days later and asked me, "Are you getting out?" I said, "Send it to them, I don't care," and walked away. Of course, they never did send it. But Mixner lived in terror, that his parents would get those photos. He was from a conservative family in New Jersey ever since. This was, I suspect, the beginning of the Nixon administration's dirty tricks campaign against the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement in the left was enemy number one for Nixon, who had come in 1968 as the anti-war candidate. He had a secret plan to end the war. And, of course, the Democrats had conducted the war up until then. And so the movement really thought that there would be hope, which quickly turned out not to be true as Nixon began escalating the war quite secretly for a while. After the October 15th moratorium, there was another one on November 15th that was massive. Here in Washington, D.C., 500,000 people converged on the city for 3 days, and it was the largest single protest there had ever been against the war in one city. And so the movement was really growing, and so was opposition to the movement as well. Just 2 days before the moratorium in November, Cy Hirsch revealed the My Lai massacre story. And I interviewed Cy Hirsch at his office on K Street, and it was hard to get in. I had to get a bunch of people who knew him to convince him that he should talk to me. And he said, "Oh, I'm so sick of talking about My Lai. I really don't want to." And although he hadn't written about it very much, what it took for him to find that story and track it down, when I finally got into his office, it was really hard getting out. He was so fascinating on the story of how he found Lieutenant Calley and then how he found everyone else, and by traveling all over the country, and how that story rolled into what became a Pulitzer Prize-winning story, which did more for the anti-war movement and for the cause against the war than any one protest ever could do. And in fact, the My Lai story radicalized many, many people who were on the fence, weren't really sure how far they wanted to go to resist the war. And the people who were becoming extremely militant and radical at that point were the weathermen. They were a fringe radical group that were part of SDS, which at the time had over 100,000 members, the Students for Democratic Society. They had started in the early 60s. Tom Hayden was one of their founders. They originally were a civil rights organization. They morphed into anti-war by the mid to late 60s, and they were huge on every campus in the country, but became very factionalized ideologically. And by 1969, at their convention in June, one group broke off, and the group ended up generally disintegrating. But the group that broke off were very powerful and charismatic, and they called themselves the Weathermen, naming themselves after the Bob Dylan song. And they were run by Mark Rudd, who you heard from in the video, who had run the Columbia student protests in '68, Bernadine Dorn, who at the time had graduated from U Chicago Law School, was extremely charismatic, Bill Ayers. I interviewed Rudd, Bernadine Dorn, Bill Ayers, Kathy Wilkerson, Brian Flanagan. I tried to get to as many of them as I could. And they were all fascinating. They all had very different takes on all the things that they did during that time. But October 2, the other was their first militant action. It was called Days of Rage, and they took to the streets in October and early October in Chicago, and decided to fight the cops. They were just going to fight them. They brought, bats and bricks, and they broke windows, and most of them were arrested, and it was considered a complete disaster. But it didn't change their opinion, which was it was time to fight fire with fire, and that all of these peaceful protests were doing nothing, and they needed to be heard, and they needed to take the movement into their own hands and escalate the movement. At the same time, they were really following the Black Panthers, who during this year were peaking. They had over 24 offices all over the country. 200,000 readers were reading the Black Panther newspaper. They had a budget of over $1 million, and they were the vanguard of the movement. They had started in '66 in Oakland, and were also very militant, were very anti-government, and were being gunned down right and left as when they were confronting the cops, and they were gunning down cops themselves. So in the year of '69, 27 Panthers were killed, and about 150 were jailed. And J. Edgar Hoover considered them enemy number one. Hoover, we mustn't forget, was head of the FBI for 48 years under 6 presidents. So he had his own secret police, and he called it COINTELPRO. And there were 2,000 agents whose job it was to infiltrate, disrupt, and eliminate New Left organizations. Panthers and the Weathermen being the first on their list, but they infiltrated a lot of feminist groups. They infiltrated the Vietnam Vets Against the War. Most of the people I talked to got their FBI files, and many of them they were this high, thousands and thousands of pages. I also interviewed a fascinating FBI agent, Bill Dyson, who was in charge of the Weatherman portfolio. And he was in retirement in Florida and was fascinating about what it was like following them. And he was one of my favorite interviews, actually. So the Weathermen started in October. Then in December, Fred Hampton was murdered. We saw him quickly give a speech. He was the first person to want a rainbow coalition. Jesse Jackson sort of cribbed from his notes. He wanted to bring the progressive white movement together with the progressive black movement. He was very charismatic. He was only 21. And he was also a major threat to Hoover. So on December 6th, he was killed in his sleep. 80 gunshots were shot into his house, where he had been drugged by his bodyguard, who was a FBI infiltrator, and he never woke up. The Chicago police called it a firefight and that they were just defending themselves. That, of course, later was disproven. But it was a very important moment because it was when the Weathermen decided to get violent. They felt that they needed to take on defending the Panthers. They could no longer be the sort of white lily white militants, and they wanted to get in and fight back. And so by March, they famously blew up the townhouse in Greenwich Village on 11th Street, and 3 of them were killed by mistake as they were building a bomb that they intended to detonate at Fort Dix at a Army officers' dance. And it would have killed dozens of people, including the wait staff, the bands, the band players, the dates. It would have been an absolute fiasco. And so, in a way, it was fortunate that that didn't take place. And after the townhouse, the Weathermen decided just to take on a bombing light campaign, and they no longer tried to kill people when they were bombing. The amazing thing about them, Bill Dyson told me, is that later, from 69 until 77, the Weathermen managed 38 separate bombings. And he told me, I had that list memorized at one time. The Weather Underground was extremely sophisticated with their devices, more so than many people realize. None of the Weathermen bombings have been solved. They put one in the Pentagon in May 1972. So with that in mind, we'd still like to find out who did them. However, the statute of limitations is over for all of them, except for the Golden Gate Police Department in California, where a police officer was killed. And nobody has ever been named. We closed the Weather Underground investigation in 77, which is when I wrote the closing report, because the group had become defunct. Many of them were underground for 10 years and surfaced in 1980. On May 1st, President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia. He had been bombing Cambodia secretly for a year, but then he wanted to bring troops in. He announced it, and the student movement went crazy. This clearly looked like another escalation of the war. The young students at Kent State, a very conservative college in Ohio, were out demonstrating along with everyone else in the Ohio National Guard, shot 13 of them and killed 4. I interviewed Joe Lewis, who you heard from earlier, who was shot, Dean Kaler, who was also shot and paralyzed for the rest of his life. He now is a champion wheelchair marathon racer. He's an amazing character. I interviewed Laurel Krause, who was Allison Krause's sister. She was the woman who was killed, and then 6 other people who witnessed the shooting, and that was a very difficult chapter to write, but it was also fascinating because no one forgot anything. The level of detail of people's memories of what happened, hour by hour over that weekend was stunning to me. And the other thing that really shocked me was the kids who were shot and when they were in the hospital received hate mail. From people who said, I wish the guard had had better aim. You should be dead. You don't deserve to be alive. And it gave me a sense that I didn't quite really understand viscerally until then of how divided the country was. Right soon after that, there was the Hard Hat Riot, which was another example of how divided the country was. It was May 9th down on Wall Street, and John Lindsay, who was also called the mayor of Hanoi by his detractors, had asked for all of the flags to be flown at half-mast. And the police department and the firemen were not, as many people and were not happy about that. And 200 men in hard hats carrying American flags descended on a group of protesters on Wall Street and beat them to a pulp. The cops just watched. 70 of them were hospitalized, and it was called the Hard Hat Riot. Nixon invited them all to the White House the following week to congratulate them. So as much as we might think that the Kent State students were martyrs, many people really didn't think that, and the country was splitting up. Meanwhile, the counterculture was in full full swing. 3 million kids were living in communes all over the country, and that's probably a small number. The number could be larger. Also, at least 3 million people had dropped acid. One of the most interesting people I interviewed was a man who personally manufactured 120 million tabs of Orange Sunshine in a castle in Belgium. And he was part of a secret group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And they felt that if they could just turn on America, there would be peace, we'd get out of the war, and everyone would be happy. And they felt very evangelical about this. And everyone I interviewed, I asked them, one of my stock questions was, when was the first time you dropped acid? I'd love to ask all of you guys that too. And of course, it turned out to be usually a very important moment when a certain level of consciousness was changed, when the anti-authoritarian politics that people had were beginning to really sink in, and people were changing their lives and not wanting to live the kind of lives, of course, that their parents wanted them to live. I interviewed Peter Coyote, who was part of the Diggers. He was one of the great leaders of the counterculture in San Francisco. He's now an actor, and this is what he told me. I've always suspected that the environmental movement was engendered in some way by the shootings at Kent State. When people saw that the culture was willing to shoot their own children to keep the war machine going, I think a lot of people moved their energy into the environment where they could see it as a future struggle, but it didn't engender police resistance and getting shot and killed. We had already left confrontational politics. By that time, we were deep into cultural warfare. So we saw the news of the Kent and Jackson State shootings as the fulfillment of predictions that we had made. The Diggers were cultural revolutionaries. We began to analyze the situation more deeply and realized that the entire culture was producing the Vietnam War. This wasn't a political aberration. If you accepted the premises of profit and private property, you wound up in Vietnam. When I asked everybody how they thought, everyone I interviewed, how they thought the movement had panned out, what had succeeded, what hadn't, the general consensus was that the cultural revolutionaries won and the political revolutionaries lost. If you have to really boil it down, that was a conclusion that most of the people I talked to believed. One of the last events of my book, actually, I decided to creep into September. And in September of 70, Timothy Leary was in prison in San Luis Obispo in California, and it didn't look good for him. He was there for 3 joints. At this point, the Nixon administration was using draconian drug laws to get people off the streets. It was just a way of tying people up who were trouble, and Leary was definitely trouble. So the Weather Underground did this amazing caper. They were funded by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and who were the rich hippies at the time. And the Weather were underground at that stage. They were all fugitives, but they had different IDs, and they were traveling all over the country quite successfully. None of them were ever discovered. It was one of the biggest manhunts in FBI history, actually. And they were all these Ivy League educated people who, didn't really know about how to make fake ID or be fugitives. So it's pretty impressive. But the Brotherhood paid them to get Leary out of jail. And Leary escaped, and he made it all the way to Algiers, where he hung out with Eldridge Cleaver, who was there also as a fugitive, and that didn't go very well. But one of my favorite communiques, which were the way that Weather would let the public know what they were doing, came out right after this successful jailbreak. And Bernadine Dorn on September 15th of 1970 issued a communique. It was a tape recorder, tape that she gave to a radio station, and then it went out over the airwaves. And this is what she said. The Weather Underground has had the honor and pleasure of helping Dr. Timothy Leary escape from the POW camp in San Luis Obispo, California. Dr. Leary has been held against his will and against the will of millions of kids in this country. He was a political prisoner, captured for the work he did in helping all of us begin the task of creating a new culture on the barren wasteland that has been imposed on this country by Democrats, Republicans, capitalists, and creeps. That's the best part. LSD and grass, like the herbs and cactus and mushrooms of the American Indians and countless civilizations that have existed on this planet, will help us make a future world where it will be possible to live in peace. Now we are at war. Our organization commits itself to the task of freeing these prisoners of war. We are outlaws. We are free. So I thought I'd end with that declaration and take questions from the audience. I also want you to come forward if you have a story that you'd like to share briefly, because I have a feeling from all the nods and eye contact that I've been getting that you might have something to tell us.
So I was there. That year was my first year at Yale Law School. My late husband was an anti-war activist. I met him my first day. We went to the moratorium in New Haven and the mobilization down here.
Let me move.
And I think you're wrong. I think that we didn't. The war in Vietnam was ended by the draft. Once middle-class men started to be drafted, that brought in their parents, and that was the end of the war. It went on until 1975, but we were out by 1971 or 1972. It was Vietnamized.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we would still be there, just like we're still there in Afghanistan for how long?
Absolutely.
15, 16 years. And it did change my life. I went in as an English major, specializing in 17th century British poetry from John Donne to John Milton, and came out an activist. It was an incredible time to be alive, even though I think we lost. I mean, your next book can chronicle the reaction to all that, which we are still
powerful.
Experiencing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just to add to the draft and how powerful, how politicizing it was, between 1965 and 73, when the draft was at its height, 27 million Americans were of draft age. So that gives you an idea of how important it was to that many people.
Yeah, I was young, but I absolutely caught the 60s. And I'm wondering, why did the counterculture end? In 72, McGovern lost. The war, we got out of the war. And I remember a very vibrant counterculture I grew up in. And I hate to think it ended because, like she said, white middle-class men now were going to war, being drafted, that it was more of a personal thing. Because when I was growing up, it seemed so real for everybody. I was explaining to my son's 20-something teacher, she was going to see here. I said, let me explain the 60s. Money is bad. Police and military are bad. Drugs are good.
Certain drugs. No, well, I mean, of course, the pendulum does its swinging, and its swing came back. But I think I would argue that the counterculture has had a very, very deep and important influence on who we are. And between feminism, environmentalism, gay rights, the embrace of Eastern cultures, religion, medicine. That is where this movement kind of had a deep-seated and an embedded impact on who we are as a country.
Thank you.
So I have some of those credentials of having been at the Moratorium March and Woodstock and all that stuff. And
lucky you went to Woodstock.
So I have this observation. Every year, Memorial Day, we see this, the motorcycles on the Rolling Thunder on the mall, and it seems to me that has something to do with the failure of the country to ever face the shame of Vietnam. So I think, Carl Oglesby said he thought that would never, he predicted that we'd never do that, and we'd never do it because we couldn't handle all this loss and then admit to an
Being
immoral
wrong.
and a wasted effort. And I kind of wonder if, but I don't know that that's true, because there's so much of our history that we haven't faced the shame of. We haven't faced the shame of slavery. So I kind of wonder if you have any thoughts about that. Is what explains the failure to face that shame?
That's a really, really important question, and I think that we've been struggling with Vietnam syndrome, as it's called, and for a long time, and that part of the Reagan 80s was all about regaining our patriotism and vilifying the anti-war movement. And it was a very specific strategic thing that was done by the counter-revolution at the time. And now, actually, when the anniversary, the 45th anniversary of the war came up, there was a big debate over how the Pentagon was going to treat the war, whether it was going to have it. They had a website, and were they going to treat it as this, valiant effort, or was there going to be any real truth and reconciliation? And a group of anti-war activists got together and have started a whole sort of website and movement to try to ask the country to really face what happened and to kind of accept it for what it really was. And I just think that it's very hard for America and Americans to admit that we were wrong and admit that we lost. We lost the war. And it was a bad war, and it was a shame, and obviously the people who fought in it need to be honored. But that the mistake, that Kissinger is still, wins his Nobel Prize and is still a very honored person in the foreign policy, arena. And I think it's just a very difficult thing for our country to accept that. I wish I had a better answer for you, though.
I was wondering what part has someone like Studs Terkel and Oscar Lewis, both terrific oral historians, played in your role as an oral historian?
Thank you. I mean, I worship Studs Terkel. This is my first oral history, and I wrote it in a different way. My model was the book Edie, about Edie Sedgwick. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it was written by George Plimpton and Gene Stein, and many people consider it the perfect book because it seamlessly weaves together interviews with people. It's a biography of her, but an oral history biography. Studs Terkel, who had this incredible ability to interview people and get them to really tell him their stories, would write about each person individually. And I wanted this to be a narrative, more the way Edie was. And so, as you'll see, it reads a little bit like a conversation. And it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and tells a whole story. And so it's a slightly different form than his. But thanks for asking.
He was on your mind when you were composing, I guess.
Yeah. Well, when I decided to do an oral history, because I'd never done one before, so of course he's the king.
Yeah, he is the king. Thank you.
Excuse me. I noticed you just alluded to an answer to the previous question. I noticed that you just alluded in answer to the previous question about whatever the counter-revolution has been, but obviously it's been very successful.
Very.
And it was, what do you account for the fact that there was no political revolution at the time?
Well, I would argue that one of the reasons why was the left was lost its audience because of the extremism, and that they also want that many of the left at that point were communists. And they actually were hoping to have a communist system in America, which really wasn't going to work. So there was that.
I don't think there were very many communists.
Well, I mean, a lot of the weathermen were. Nah, I mean that was more fringy, but the extremists turned off a lot of people. And that, and they are the ones. I mean, in my book, Mark Rudd will say we played right into Nixon's hands. We did more for Nixon and more for the counter-revolution than Nixon could do, and that there was a sense that by becoming extreme and by pushing the envelope so far that it created a pretty violent, not violent, but extreme counter-revolution. And I mean, Nixon won in a landslide in 1972.
Yeah, that's true, but I don't think he won in a landslide in 1968.
No.
And there was a lot of feeling. I mean, I don't know what the feeling was. I was not concerned about the war in Vietnam. But all I'm saying is that when that went on, it was clear that the good people were in favor of attacking the war, and the good people were opposed to the war, and yet they did not have any political influence at all.
No. And many of the people I talked to said we were so busy protesting and getting a mass movement that we forgot about the money and we forgot about the politics, and we weren't electing people in a grassroots way who were progressive, and the left wasn't very strategic about how they went about achieving power. And so they lost because the right was much more strategic about it, about how to deregulate the economy and elect the people they wanted to get elected in a very quiet way.
Who are these right people?
I don't know. I think I'll have to do a book about them.
Next question.
Yes, I was at the University of Chicago at the time that these things happened, so more an observer, but still. I'd like to argue that, in fact, the counter-revolution, so to speak, has been far more stronger and more long-lasting. And just a couple of points that I'd like you to react to. Mm-hmm. One, of course, was that a couple of years later, we had Watergate, and I really think that the combination may have been the underpinning for for selling the idea that government is bad, government doesn't do anything you'd want. And second, when the first I heard that the Bush administration was considering going to war in Iraq, I was appalled. I thought it was a terrible idea. And then I wondered whether it was because I was a member of this generation. But I was right.
You were right.
But aside from that, we haven't seen any of the demonstrations against these wars that have gone on much longer, and I think it shows, among other things, how important the draft was back then.
Absolutely, the draft was very engaging and politicizing. I mean, your generation was called was called the awakened generation. And I would argue that one of the reasons why they were so awakened was because of the draft. And many people I interviewed said that they felt that one of the mistakes of the movement was, and the movement didn't end the draft, but that the draft, by ending the draft in 1973, really helped the government because they then knew they weren't going to have a mass uprising against wars. And the other thing about current wars is we still don't have as many boots in the ground. And we had at one point almost 600,000 troops in Vietnam. We had huge amounts of boots on the ground, and now the wars are fought from above because politically it's not going to work to have another real Vietnam.
Yeah. But the whole issue of the resistance to, just the idea that now the troops are wonderful and patriotism is applauded, which is
one of the biggest mistakes of the anti-war movement was, early on, it changed later by the end of the 60s when the vets became some of the most important parts of the anti-war movement. They brought a huge amount of the unintended consequence of Vietnamization when Nixon brought the troops home was that they became the newest, most important force in the anti-war movement. And so I just think that the movement can never, ever condemn the soldiers, because the soldiers are not the people making the decisions, and that will never happen again. And that right now our soldiers are paid to be soldiers, and they choose to be soldiers, and it's a very different military. And also we have terrorism. We're being attacked. So it's a very different thing than Vietnam.
Clara, we have just about 3 minutes and 3 or 4 more questions, so if we can run through them real quickly, we can let everybody ask something.
Hi. Back when I was executive secretary of NACLA in New York.
Oh, great.
We did. We had several. We organized several marches, several of which ended up in our being beaten pretty badly by the hard hats.
But which ones were
New
they?
York.
Can you tell us when and where they were?
Yeah, it was in 67, 68 in New York. But what I really wanted to get your views on was that after 68, really, 69, there was this split that took place between, I would say, the lefties and the liberals, perhaps, where a lot of people, myself, I guess, included, were into organizing, I guess, revolution, and we lost the main piece of the working class, and that continued. That split seems to have continued, and for the next 30 years, perhaps continues still. I'd like your views on that.
Yeah, and I think that answers a lot of your question. And I interviewed Michael Kazin, who lives right up the street, who is a American historian, but was in SDS at Harvard. And he said that he felt that so many of the things that the students did and the lefties did was really alienating to the middle class. And that therefore they lost a lot of potentially, important troops in the movement because of cultural issues and because of being so lefty that they were not, they weren't very popular among the working class. And now, of course, it's still an issue where you could say that it's bizarre that so many working class people are not Democrats. And even though economically it would make much more sense for them. And that's the cultural divide and for a lot of reasons, I'm guessing.
We'll take two more questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Clara, I think it's interesting. One of the points, I don't know if you draw this out in the book, is very much the issue about the class divide. Because when you talk about, I was in the free speech movement in Berkeley and then later on with the administration at the university. So trying to bring some, but trying to bring forward the agenda of what the free speech movement was about. But one of the things that was clear to me, and I was, representing some of the student groups in the movement, was that Number one, it was a middle class movement, but that the divisions really came up when it became a class movement. And nothing brought this more than the whole Black Panther thing. If you were in California, as I was during that whole decade, that was very clear, and it alienated a lot of the middle class students and their families and support groups from that whole cause. So that's an issue that I don't know if you bring that in the interviews in your book. The other thing was a very quick rejoinder to the gentleman before who said there were no communists in any of the movements. At least in the 60s there were. I know that for a fact.
I interviewed a lot of communists.
Exactly. And in Berkeley, some of the leaders of the free speech movement were actually members of the Communist Party USA. But anyway, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is overall, what do you draw from your whole research in terms of what's happening now with the United States? I mean, as you said, the Cultural Revolution is really what succeeded, not the political side of it. And I know well, I won't get into it, but I was a precinct captain for Jerry Rubin when he tried to run for mayor in Berkeley under the Peace and Freedom Party. And no, really,
and what
seriously.
year was that when Jerry
68.
ran?
And the idea was to try to make it part of the working political system. Well, it totally failed. It was dismal for a lot of reasons. And he then became much more radicalized, as you know, in Chicago. But what can you draw from what your research on what's happening now?
Well, I feel that the left really died. I mean, the progressive movement did not survive the 60s, and that what we're seeing now with the Bernie progressive, the Bernie Sanders movement is very much unfinished business from the 60s, and that the economic inequality that's mushroomed ever since the late 70s has really brought a level of organization and anger, and also the youth movement has sort of woken up because this is now motivating them, that they're not going to live as well as their parents, and that there aren't the same opportunities that there used to be. So I feel as if that what we're seeing now in this election is partly the unfinished business of the 60s. And who knew that we'd have three baby boomers running for president?
Yeah.
You know, that Bernie was born in 45, Trump was born in 46, and Hillary in 47. 41. He was early. He ended up not getting drafted because of it. But and Trump got many deferments, student deferments, and one medical deferment. And Hillary, of course, was class of 69. So, and this may be the last baby boom generation to run for president. At least the people born in the 40s. So I do feel like there's a certain last gasp going on right now.
All right, last
good way to put it.
Maybe not last.
Last question,
and make
'cause
it
we're
one
really-
more
we're really
after
out of time.
after the one more.
Just a very brief non-American perspective, as you can say. I'm originally from Brazil. I spent some months in '68 in France, visiting France, and as you know, it was the peak of the demonstrations and riots and upheaval. I was saying that I spent some few months in France in '68, and that was the peak of the upheavals and riots and student demonstrations. I was not part of it. I'm originally from Brazil, but I witnessed it, and I had friends there. So it was more of this was a period of upheaval, of protests in many, many other countries. Of course, here, and it was very interesting because next year, in '69, I came to visit my cousins in the U.S. who were students then. I was a college student in Brazil, so I witnessed again this turbulence in the U.S. And interesting to hear from you so many other aspects of it. Then I went back to Brazil, finished my studies, and stayed there for many, many years. And as many might be aware, that was the period of the dictatorship in Brazil. And we also had in Brazil an incredible amount of student, and not only student, upheavals there. So in general, was a time of turbulence and protest about regarding the different kind of unease about the way things were developing in many of these countries. So I just wanted to have this very brief sharing that this was happening in many
everywhere.
other places.
No, you're right. And I'd only focused on America, and so much was going on elsewhere. Thank you all for coming. I'll we can talk. It's not my fault.
I'm sorry.